Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're here with Professor John Rodden. I will not say too much because Professor Rodden has been giving several lectures already, which we have recorded over the past 2 weeks, so all of you are very familiar with Professor Rodden. Today he will speak about the 3 biggest mistakes in public speaking. I really look forward to this. This is going to be a series of 2 lectures. I think they're new. I don't think Professor Rodden has given these lectures before. This is new content which has been developed over the past few months right here at Tonga University in Taichung. The topic of today's lecture is taking improper note of your audience. And this will be followed 1 week from now with the second lecture, Advanced Stage Fright. And then there will be a third lecture, Failure to make an important point. Today, however, Professor Rodden will make an important point, which is you must think about taking proper note. So the topic for today is taking improper note of your audience. Professor Rodden, I'll give you the floor.
It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you this morning to address concern that millions, if not billions of people share, namely, how to speak in public. Speaking in public is a very different matter than speaking in a casual setting that is interpersonal. I'm sure we've all had this experience. The kind of relaxed informality that usually exists in conversation is not typical of public presentations. Larger audience, exposure to many people who will not be known to you, as well as the fact that there is often a particular occasion or other kinds of expectations related to that presentation. It's not a casual matter for dozens, let alone hundreds of people to gather together to hear someone. That is a demand on people's time, energy, and other resources. A speaker will be aware of that fact and need to prepare accordingly. And that will generate pressure, stress. And so it's not surprising that research surveys have repeatedly shown this fact. The #1 fear of people, stage fright. I did not say it's the biggest, most horrible fear. That is, it doesn't compare to being shot in cold blood on the street, or being in a plane that's shot down, but it's the most common fear. It's the fear that haunts many people in their nightmares the night before the big presentation. In fact, as I'm sure you could well imagine, the most common aspect of those nightmares related to stage fright is this: being naked in front of unknown people. Why? Because you're exposed. You're exposed. That is what public speaking means. To be exposed. To expose yourself. Now, hopefully, the exposure will be a very positive experience. See, it's one thing to be exposed in your lovely tennis shorts or bikini or some new fashion. It's another thing to be exposed naked and terrified. So, my topic today will be related to all of this. Now, at first I should mention another aspect of research surveys. When your audience forms an impression of your speaking performance, what do you think are the decisive criteria by which they judge the speaker? This is somewhat counterintuitive to what many people would think. And we don't want to err in that direction. My topic today is the 3 biggest mistakes in public speaking. And I derive that title partly from the research survey that I'll now discuss. So when people form an impression of that speech immediately after, what do they base their impression on? First impressions are important. People discussing with one another immediately what their experience of that speech was. That often tends to be a reaction that remains permanent, it's more widely shared, and it influences many people who weren't even in attendance at the speech. Is it content and organization of the speech? How important do you think content and organization will be in the final evaluation of that audience in relation to the speaker? Ladies and gentlemen, it may surprise you, as it did me, that research shows that the impression of an audience in relation to content and organization is 10% of the overall evaluation. Another factor is diction, that is, your use of language. How important is diction? Important, however, 12%. Any other factors? Yes. What about dress? 18%. More important than content and organization, and even the particular use of language. Almost equal to both of those. Dress, 18%. And finally, perhaps shockingly, %70 of the overall evaluation that an audience makes in its first impressions of a speech, delivery. Delivery. An anecdote brings this to mind. One of the greatest speakers in history overcame many obstacles in order to achieve his level of sophistication. He was the Greek king and orator Demosthenes, part of the golden age of Greece. Now, Demosthenes did indeed overcome many obstacles of a very special kind that few people manage to overcome and reach his level of proficiency, and perhaps none with such stellar results as his. Demosthenes suffered as a boy from a horrible stutter. Every time he would open his mouth, he had articulating his words. Now imagine that you are a prince who will be expected one day to be delivering speeches in public. And in a culture where rhetoric, that is, the art of oratory, is celebrated by thinkers and intellectuals. Aristotle's Rhetoric, one of the great treatises in philosophy. What did Demosthenes do? He could have easily just delegated it to somebody at court, spoken privately, and nursed his shame. Instead, and this story, of course, may be apocryphal, but nonetheless, it's highly fitting. As a boy, he began to go down to the sea, and every day for hours, he would challenge himself. He would put pebbles in his mouth to complicate and render far more difficult articulation, the proper enunciation of his words. And day after day for years would practice with the pebbles in his mouth. Several pebbles, then fewer and fewer, and then finally, every day when he took out all the pebbles, he noticed, this is comparatively easy now. I'm stuttering over far fewer words. And legend has it that by the time he became king, there was no more stutter. In fact, having coped with the ocean and pebbles in his mouth, articulation was no difficulty whatsoever. He himself had challenged himself with the worst, and under normal conditions, it was now a breeze. And so he was asked at the end of a long life, King Demosthenes, you are the greatest orator that Greece has ever witnessed, perhaps the greatest orator in history. What is the secret of great oratory? And Demosthenes answered, there are three keys to great oratory. And any audience will immediately respond if you meet these criteria. And the young Greek reporter said, what are they? What are the three? The three secrets, the three keys to great oratory that you have mastered. And Demosthenes responded, delivery, delivery, delivery. Exactly what our research surveys 2 millennia later have confirmed. Delivery, delivery, delivery. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is not surprising that today, when I discuss with you the 3 biggest mistakes in public speaking, they all involve delivery. Overcome these mistakes, and you will have at least reached 70% of your goal. And I submit to you that it should not be that difficult, perhaps with the assistance of a loved one or a confidant, to go a substantial way in also improving on the 18% of dress. I rely on my friends. That leaves you with content and organization and diction. Not easy, but a much more manageable portion of those first impressions. Now, for the sophisticated listener, first impressions will never be enough. And for those people, yes, the quality of your language, the role of diction, the logic, rationality of your speech, content organization, will be of crucial importance. But here we are primarily talking about first impressions, which often become lasting impressions, and maybe the only impressions of the listener who is not going to reflect a great deal later about your speech, but is nonetheless an audience member who has sacrificed time, energy, and resources to be there, and may influence other people. Everybody in attendance is important. First impressions are also important, not just enduring ones, or not just the impressions of the reflective listener, the sophisticated audience member. Value everyone. Today I will restrict myself in this first lecture to a discussion of the first big mistake. But I will mention the other two in passing. The first big mistake in public speaking, thinking improper note, taking improper note of your audience, taking improper note. The second big mistake, advanced stage fright of the fearless, stage fright of those who believe they have no stage fright. The third big mistake, failing to make a powerful point, a truly powerful point. In the first case, taking improper note of your audience, what's that big mistake? The reliance on note-taking. Improper note. The over-reliance on notes. Notes. Let's discuss that. The over-reliance on notes. This reflects fear, and ultimately, I would submit, though I do not mean this to be voiced harshly, cowardice. It's based on a mistaken analogy that the reading experience with the kind of detail that the written word that can be repeatedly reviewed in a manuscript permits is somehow also possible in speaking. It is not. The ear is a very different organ than the eye. And the public speaking situation must be respected for its enormous differences with reading a manuscript. Many, many colleagues of mine, well-known professors, confess that they have no stage fright whatsoever in a classroom situation with students. Now, perhaps that is not surprising. After all, one would hope that a professor with many years of experience in his chosen field of specialty would be able to address young people without that experience. But it's not so much that, because very often the same professor has told me that before a public audience, even if it's not an academic conference of other specialists, stage fright is deep. Well, doesn't he or she have the same expertise in relation to that lay audience as to a class? Yes. The key then, you see, is unfamiliarity with that speaking situation. The lack of preparedness. You've taught the class, or at least classes like it, dozens or hundreds of times. How often have you spoken in front of a public audience? At least a public audience of that composition? Perhaps never. So you need to prepare. Now, the unfortunate response of many people, not so much in a classroom setting as in public speaking, because it is not something that is repeated endlessly, it's unfamiliar, is excessive reliance on notes. Your manuscript becomes a crutch. It deprives you of direct contact with your audience, the kind of rapport, the intimacy, the immediate human connection that you are seeking. The advantage of public speaking, after all, is that the content is filtered through the dynamic live personality of another human being who is present to that audience. How many times have you gone to a lecture or a public presentation and walked out after someone has read for an hour from his manuscript and said to yourself, if not to other people, why didn't he just email me that manuscript? I could read it in my leisure at home instead of wasting my time. Now, perhaps that was a very well-written presentation. The diction, the use of language may have been extraordinary. But the ear is a comparatively lazy organ and does not have the advantage of the eye in being able to repeatedly review, go back over difficult portions. So when you hear something, it needs to be emphasized in a different way. A speech will allow the possibility of repetition, what would be perceived as redundancy in a written communication. And rather than resent it or find it offensive, welcome it, because the reminders help. You only get one chance in hearing, and then it goes by. In a book, in a manuscript, the chances are infinite to go back again and again and again and again and again and again and reread. Now, of course, iTunes and other technologies do permit us to see again a speech. But a live speech is something different, and that is not a typical experience. You don't typically attend 3 nights in a row the same speech, even if you love the speaker. Once was enough, whether you got it or not. Especially if there's an attendance fee associated with it. So, confidence and trust sufficient to overcome the stage fright of being exposed without your manuscript. You see, this is a relatively simple point, but many experienced speakers, including leading professors executives will walk in front of an audience and begin reading from manuscripts, or look down all the time at extensive notes. They have made a misjudgment on 2 scores. First of all, the misjudgment that the audience so values the nuances and subtleties of that detail that they render that aspect of your speech more important than the direct human connection with you. No. The second is, and this is of course an aspect of your common nightmare, that you will get to a point in your speech and forget what comes next. Paralysis. What comes next? My mind is blank. Ah! What do I say? And true, if you have relied exclusively on that written manuscript and are totally dependent on that as your source for your speech, with no other form of preparation, that may be a rather embarrassing moment. And I have known many speakers who have never recovered, and even a few who have simply apologized to the audience and sat down and ended their speech at that point in utter humiliation. But the misjudgment is the problem, not the memory lapse. You see, an audience will readily forgive very human mistakes like forgetfulness. What they will not forgive so readily is what I am referring to as cowardice. That is, the cowardice of insisting on imposing on them a half hour or an hour of this. That is what they will not so readily forgive. And perhaps some will also not so readily forgive. You're depriving them by sitting down in your indulgent humiliation of the rest of your speech. Because if you simply apologized and said that you will try now to extemporize in whatever impromptu fashion the rest of your speech, even inferior performance will be forgiven. And certainly, an energetic, sincere question and answer session will compensate. Now, how do you acquire sufficient confidence and trust to overcome this kind of stage fright? The cowardice that we all have. It is not by eliminating fright, let alone stress or tension. A modicum of stress and tension are positive. You want to have a certain kind of nervous energy that will produce the adrenaline to get you pumping, to get your mind in active gear. It is your natural form of caffeine. Again, it is a matter of excess. When that tips over into the area of stage fright that can lead to paralysis, it is excessive. And by the same token, let me emphasize again that what we're talking about here is taking improper note. The judicious use of notes is acceptable, and it may be enhancing your speech. If you need it, do it. But you see, these notes should be the kind you have immediate access to, and then they are unobtrusively put aside. They are simply a telegraphic reminder to you of your next major point, or perhaps a key phrase, or perhaps a statistic that you make sure you want to have remembered accurately. Or perhaps it's a citation or a quotation. I myself have often written down exact quotations, especially if I know that this will be on television. The last thing that you want to have happen after the speech is over is for a commentator to criticize you because you inaccurately quoted someone in whatever paraphrasing you used. Don't expose yourself that way. To have written in front of you the exact quotation is no form of cowardice. It is insurance that the focal point of your speech is not diverted by a debating point of someone insisting that that misquotation is somehow a decisive weakness in your speech. Typically, it's not. On the other hand, I would say, why not commit to memory that quotation and make it even more effective? But the way to overcome taking improper note, which is excessive reliance on your note-taking, the manuscript, the constant reliance on written notes, is not through memorization. That is, it is also a mistake to go to the other extreme, and I've seen speakers do that. I have given some consultations to executives, including CEOs, in which they proudly tell me on the day before the speech, I'm not using any notes. And I say, I'm impressed, very good. I've memorized it word for word. And I've seen the same executive then get to that difficult moment in the speech. I forget. Suddenly, the word-for-word memorization, the next word doesn't come. The mind is blank. Panic. The nightmare scenario. What comes next? And because he has memorized it in such a linear fashion, simply skipping that point and moving to some part of the speech that he might remember is not possible. Again, he's stuck. Just as stuck as the other executive who walked in confidently with his manuscript. Neither extreme is appropriate. Memorizing important parts of your speech can be very helpful. Knowing how you begin, knowing how you end, knowing any crucial quotation, knowing the exact citation of your source, and knowing the overall direction of your speech in your memory. That should be enough to give a quality speech. Judicious note-taking, judicious use of the memory, quite advisable, if necessary. If you can dispense with them and have no notes necessary, and no reliance on memory that might lead to to stage fright and paralysis. That is, what is accessible to consciousness, but not yet committed indelibly to memory word for word, is probably the best, because then you can much more easily extemporize and speak impromptu, given the needs of your audience. If you notice, for example, that audience members seem to have puzzled faces at a particular point, just because you have the next point memorized, you do not move immediately to it. Spend another moment or two explaining in greater detail that earlier point, so that your audience can be sure to follow you well through the rest of the speech. That's like we're driving along, you see, and I come to an unexpected portion of the road. Perhaps there's construction on it. Perhaps there are potholes that were not there your last time. You move through there more carefully. That's that audience. Every audience will be unique. So, how do you then overcome these difficulties of stage fright that can lead to panic and paralysis and embarrassment and even humiliation? The awful exposure of your worst nightmare. The reason that people do report stage fright as the #1 fear that they confront. A very simple way. Simple but not so easy for people. And I here take a note, a proper note, from Demosthenes. What he might have said after delivery, was that the key to his own success, that he might advise other people, would be preparation, preparation, preparation. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have practiced that speech a dozen times, perhaps 20, 30, 40 times in advance, then the final occasion of your public performance should be like Demosthenes when he became king. The pebbles have been removed. The ocean is no longer competing with you. It's a breeze. But I caution you, especially those who are liable to be overconfident, or perhaps procrastinators, do not assume that you can wing it. Do not assume that on your first attempt that all will always go well. No. Only the most experienced professional speaker can walk in cold and on that first attempt retain the confidence and trust to make that a superb presentation. And on that occasion, only in the rarest of good fortune. I recently gave a series of talks at some leading universities in America, Stanford University, University of California, Berkeley, and elsewhere. At least a dozen times I practiced that speech beforehand. You buttonhole anybody you can. And let's say there's always the evening shower at home, and there's always the mirror in front of your bathroom. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Who is the best spoken of them all? Have that mirror say back to you, this is a good speech. Trust yourself. No notes necessary. No word-for-word memorization. But if possible, go to live human beings. This is what your loved ones are for. This kind of favor. Mother, father, boyfriend, girlfriend, roommates. Very few people who care about you, especially if they know that a speaking opportunity has been presented to you and the occasion is imminent, whether they are planning to attend or not, will begrudge you the opportunity to speak before them. Get the bugs out. Get the flaws out before the decisive public performance. And so, ladies and gentlemen, do not believe that you are alone. One of the reasons that so many audience members will forgive you and feel deep sympathy for you when any flaw does appear in your speech is that they've had the same nightmare as you, and they would not want to be in your place right now. They will forgive the mistakes that are inadvertent and spontaneous. They will not forgive the 3 biggest mistakes that you have planned because of your cowardice. That you have planned to avoid them and frustrate the human connection and deprive them of the rapport that they seek with you. The eye contact, the human reality of that content being filtered through the dynamism of your individual personality. By keeping your nose in a manuscript, insulting them with a level of detail that they cannot appreciate and will not grasp sufficiently. This has been just the first big mistake. There are 2 others, even by executive, professional speakers, that are committed readily. Our next 2 sessions will be devoted to those. But let me just tell you again that the way to achieve excellence in public speaking, as Demosthenes first told us, and as our researchers confirmed, delivery, delivery, delivery is achieved through the very humble, modest strategy of preparation, preparation, preparation. Thank you for your time and attention.